Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and I've got a couple bins that I classify them as African night crawlers, but to tell you the truth, I couldn't even tell you for sure if they're really African night crawlers. A lot of people comment telling me that they don't look like African night crawlers, but until I know what they really are, I don't know what else to call them. But whatever, the bottom line is I've got two bins that I consider to be African night crawlers that are due for feeding because it's been 10 days since they last got fed, and they got a pretty good amount of food at that time, 10 days ago. It's a reason I waited 10 days before feeding them, but they're two bins that are varying in ages. Hey Siri, how many days have passed since September 18th?
It was 87 days ago.
Yeah, 87 days. We're coming up on 3 months in the case of this bin here. It's the older of the two. Over here I've got another one. Hey Siri, how many days have elapsed since October 13th?
It was 62 days ago.
So that's a little bit over 2 months old now. So I'm going to be feeding these two bins today. I already bought the food down. It's all sitting there on the bench ready to go. So why don't we get to work feeding these things? The feeding itself is fairly routine. Besides a carton full of used coffee, as well as the filters that I'm going to use as bedding material, I've got some pulverized eggshell that we're going to add as grit, and I attempted to create two fairly equal portions of food, one for each container. So let's get the first of the bins out here and feed. Okay, so here we have the younger of the two bins. In the case of this bin, I like to cover up with plastic bags usually, but in this case I've integrated the plastic bag with another thing that I like to cover up with, which is a sheet of cardboard too. So here the cardboard was simply slipped inside of the plastic bag, and then I just used a piece of blue tape here to cover the whole thing up, close it up. And it's funny because I think somebody even mentioned the other day that I should seal up my bags with blue tape, keep the worms from crawling in there. So I'm already one step ahead of you. I've done it, but only in that one case. Here's a pretty good chance to get a close look at some of the worms. A lot of people point out how the African night crawlers have a really dark, purplish, iridescent kind of a coloration to them. And I mean, some of these actually do, but you'll also start to notice that the tails on these things are yellow, which would really kind of lend itself to being more in the red wiggler sort of category. So let's get some of these little guys off of here, so we could remove the paper without any problem. I think we'll just leave them on the paper. We'll fold it in half so they remain cozy and damp and sheltered from the bright lights. This material's got a good moisture level to it, that's for sure. And if I'm not mistaken, that was something we observed last time we were in here 10 days ago. And we consciously left it that way since these bins are still young enough to give us plenty of time to deal with what could potentially end up being maybe an overly damp container later. So the idea here was to just give the worms a nice space where they should feel comfortable pretty much everywhere, roaming around, breaking the material down, even on the outskirts where things might tend to get a little bit drier. But yeah, everything in this bin is quite damp, I must say. So I'm starting to wonder if it might be time to give this bin a chance to air out a little bit. I did that recently with another of my bins. Because as much as the worms like it, I also don't want to end up with a big muddy mess. This is the younger of the two bins, so this one's definitely got more time to air out if it needed to. So after 2 months, I would think this thing's probably still has a couple more months of composting action left in it. All of these large chunks of bedding that you see down here as I'm tilling around all need a good amount of time to break down. Although the worms definitely like the moisture, so I'm still torn as to whether I should or should not. The one thing I definitely noticed though, which is a little bit different from the last time we came into these bins, was the way, even though there's still a good amount of moisture in here, I was almost expecting to see a good bunch of springtails cruising around in this material, because I think a moist environment is where they would normally thrive, and we've been seeing them in here in these bins recently. But it seems like their numbers have diminished since the last time we were in here. Let me just slow down a bit here and see what I can see. So yeah, I mean, you know, sometimes you do need to sort of turn up the material a little bit to see them a little bit more easily. And now that I do turn the material up a little bit more, I believe I am seeing a little bit of springtail activity. But it does seem like the numbers of springtails are a little bit less than we had observed previously. So what to do? I haven't really gone right down the middle yet, which is where the last feeding would have been applied. But I have been catching little glimpses of it here and there. And it does seem like there are some leftovers remaining in here. I don't remember what the food was, but it does seem like this would be some of it over here. So let's get a sense of how things look in here by opening up the feeding area and seeing what we can see. The other thing I saw down here, which is a little bit unusual, is a lot of completely dry leaves too. I would have thought that by now this stuff would have gotten drenched, considering the amount of moisture in this bin, but somehow it got protected from getting damp, and it's still down there in its fairly dry state that it was in when I placed it in here 10 days ago. Interesting. So at this point, by mixing it in with the more damp surrounding stuff, it's definitely getting moistened, and we're just kind of going to let it get blended in as part of the bedding at this point. And although I thought I had seen some fairly significant scraps of food in here when I first started probing into here, I've got to admit I'm now having trouble locating anything significant. I mean, like here, for example, I believe that this is a little bit of, partially broken down food that was probably part of the last feeding. This is just bedding. It's just, I guess, places where I feel a little bit more moisture, a little bit more dampness is where I'm assuming the previous feedings were. So maybe they've actually done a pretty good job breaking down the food that they received last time. Unless all I did here was sort of blend it in. Okay, like here, for example, this would be the stem end of a piece of vegetable. And at the stem end, you've got the stem itself, which starts to become a little bit tougher, and anything like that might take a bit longer to break down. But other than that, it's one of the few things I've noticed in here which was clearly identifiable. I believe I also, here's another one, sort of similar. But that's not much. I thought I had stumbled on, here it is, okay. I thought I had stumbled on the husk of a mango seed as well. The seed itself that used to be inside of it is long gone at this point. I believe that that's what they normally go for. But the husk itself will probably get broken down too in time. So yeah, maybe the timing on this feeding was pretty good actually. Trying to make a little bit of a pit that we can drop today's feeding into. I did anticipate that, since to the best of my recollection the last feeding was pretty sizable, I felt like there'd be leftovers, so I didn't size today's feeding to be very large. I made it, to me it just seems like, almost like a modest to average sized feeding. As far as bedding goes, a lot of times I like to drop a little bit of fresh bedding in along with the food, and maybe we can do that today, because the leafy stuff that was placed in here as bedding for the last feeding has been kind of blended in with everything and pushed aside at this point, so it's kind of all over the place at this point. So why don't we grab a handful of this shredded paper that I've got a pretty good sized collection of still. I thought it might be gone by this time, but it's been sticking around longer than I anticipated, so we're going to use some of that today. So I'll go grab a handful right now, like so, and we'll scatter it in here pretty loosely. But you'll also remember that I had these old coffee filters too, which I wanted to include as bedding in the feeding zone too. So we'll just chunk them up a little bit. And I think with those few pieces of paper thrown down in here to go along with the food, we'll be in pretty good shape to throw the food in right on top of that. It'll almost be like a nice little landing pad for the food to rest on top of. So the food is, what do we got? A whole variety of things here. Carrots, the leaves of something, bits of tomato, in fact a half of a tomato here, even a half of a avocado that started going bad, half of a cucumber, all kinds of scrumptious food items, some of which might take a little while, such as the skin of this avocado. But I would think that the majority of this stuff, like this cucumber, will probably be totally gone by the time we check in here again. You know, I'm also going to throw in a little bit of coffee, but first I'll add the grit. I stocked up on grit by pulverizing a whole bunch of eggshells that I had been collecting for a while. So I'm in pretty good shape when it comes to my grit supply right now. And what else do we have? Just these old bits of food that are still kind of floating around. This old mango seed. Throw that back in here, and these two little stems of something that we encountered on the way down. But things look pretty good in here. I'm just debating on what to do in terms of how to restore the bin before putting it back up on the shelf. Do I leave it covered and allow it to remain nice and damp the way it is, or do I give it a chance to air out a little bit since it is so damp? Decisions. I think just the fact that I'm seeing little bits of moisture pooling up at the bottom of the container, I'm wondering if it would make good sense to give this bin just a little bit of time to air out. So maybe I'll skip putting the plastic coverings back on, or maybe another option would be to put the plastic covering on in such a way that maybe it's folded in half, or maybe wrinkled up a little bit so it doesn't go all the way out to the very edges of the container. And then maybe at least out on the outer edges the bin can evaporate off a little bit of the moisture that's in here. Yeah, why don't we do it that way? Oh, but I forgot, we can't do that with this lid, because this lid has its plastic container integrated into the cardboard, so I can't really reduce its size by any. Do I feel safe just leaving it open like this? I always worry because by stuff being open like this, you know, flying insects can make their way in very readily. But they'll usually, I don't know, the flying insects will usually seem to want a place to be able to hide. So I think this should be fine just like this. It is quite damp, and I think by covering it up only with this piece of paper, it should be able to dry off a little bit at least. And you know, maybe not all the way up until the next time we feed. Maybe next time I'm down here feeding some of my other worms, if I feel like it's time to restore the plastic coverings, I could just throw it right back on. But for now, let's put it back up on the shelf the way it is here with no plastic coverings. And hopefully that'll lead to the bin drying off a little bit. I think that'll do this bin a little bit of good. All right, let's go ahead and get to the older of the two African nightcrawler containers. Well, in the case of this one, it's not even a bin, it's a bag actually. And, you know, because it is a bag, theoretically it should be able to ventilate some of the moisture that is able to permeate the container. Although since it is pretty much resting up against the plastic, I don't know, maybe it's not even providing any sort of ventilation benefit at this point at all. What do we have here? Let's start removing some of these coverings. Kind of a similar setup, plastic covering up a sheet or two of newspaper. Look at that. Cocoons, 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 cocoons. Definitely got a good number of cocoons just resting right out here on the surface of this paper. Not a whole lot of castings, but definitely evidence of mating, which is a good thing to see. I'm also noticing a couple gnats, fruit flies, I don't know what they are, but some sort of little flying insects buzzing around here and there, but not too many, luckily. I think I had seen a good number of them in the past. I'm kind of glad to see that they're not visible here in the huge numbers that we had observed previously. Sometimes I wonder what all these little tiny white specks are. I'm wondering if the camera is going to capture it, but like here's like a little jumble of stuff that has those little white specks all over it. And usually I'll chalk that sort of stuff up as being the grit that I add, you know, pulverized eggshell, but somehow it looks different. I'm not certain. See, even down here, you go down just a little bit deeper and there's a good bit of it. And I could just be missing it. I don't think it's moving. Yeah, look at that. There's good bits of it. I wonder if it is grit. Somehow it just doesn't look that way to me. There's so much of it. I hope it's not like the indications of some sort of a wicked outbreak that's going to occur here. It could very well be. It just looks a little bit unusual, something I don't typically recall seeing in my bins. So maybe somebody out there watching will recognize it and know what it is. Here I'm definitely seeing a greater amount of what appears to be springtail activity when I pull some of the material aside. Possibly because the material in here is quite damp too. Once I dig down, it almost seems even more damp than we saw in the last container. This to me looks like leftovers from the previous feeding. Even though in the last bin it didn't seem like we were noticing distinct bits of food, here I think we are. I mean, usually it's not a deterrent for me to not feed. If I see leftovers from the last feeding, I'll typically go ahead and I'll feed anyway, just to get that new food started so that the material can start breaking down a little bit, so that at some point soon the worms can get at that too. I'm wondering if we're going to give this bin the same treatment here, you know, and if we do, I don't want to have a lot of this food stuff out on the surface, so I'm trying to be a little bit more careful here in terms of what we leave out on the top surface and what we do is in terms of how to leave the bin at the end, because I'm starting to think that this bin might remain uncovered too. Hopefully reducing the moisture situation a little bit, and at the same time also reducing the springtail situation too. I really wonder what all that little white speckly stuff is. So, all right. I'm just going to start pushing things off a little bit here so that there's an opening at the bottom where we can place in today's feeding. Luckily, I didn't bring too much stuff down here to feed with today. I definitely think that this bin is going to benefit from being uncovered. Let it dry off a little bit. As much as the worms enjoy a nice damp environment, with this being my older of the two bins, I do feel like I should be trying to steer it in a direction where maybe at some point in the near future we could start trying to gear it up for harvest. And if the material in the bin is just way too damp, then harvesting is a little bit of a pain. So yeah, I think we're going to give this bin a similar treatment with the bedding. I think we'll drop in a handful of that shredded paper and make use of those couple of coffee filters that came down here with the food today. And then we could drop in the food, the grit, and then we'll cover up in a way that allows for a little bit of ventilation, a little bit of drying off to happen. Okay. Fairly similar to the other bin that we just finished taking care of. In fact, both bins are getting almost an identical treatment. Both bins had their material stirred around a little bit, aerated. Both bins are getting extra bedding. Maybe the bedding will help sop up a little bit of the moisture too, since it's going in dry. And then kind of a similar feeding in both cases, accompanied with grit. I mean, here I don't think you see quite as much large chunks of bedding like you see in the younger bin that we just fed. So this one definitely seems to have material in it that looks a little bit more kind of mature, a little bit further along in terms of the breakdown process. Okay. This one has almost an identical assortment, so you'll recognize these as being very similar to the stuff that the other bin just received. We'll just kind of spread it out evenly. Try to keep it down low so that I can cover it up in the end. All right. Ooh, all right. Well, I think since here we saw a good amount of leftovers, we don't have to go too overboard. This looks like a pretty good size feeding, if you ask me. Let's see if we can get things covered up here. Luckily the coffee, I think, works as a pretty good cover for the food so that it doesn't just sit out there at the surface attracting pests. I think the bigger draw for pests at this point might be some of the material that I probably tilled up while we were probing around here. I mean, a lot of it will be covered up too with the newspaper. Yeah, I think it'll help a lot for this to also not have plastic coverings on it. Give this one a chance to air out too. Maybe we'll end up with some slightly more crumbly and manageable material in this container too. Bringing back the 2 sheets of paper that we're covering things up here. Here the sheets of paper do kind of go a little further out to the edge and cover things up a little bit more thoroughly than in that other container. But still, you know, the paper, it doesn't do much in terms of holding moisture in, so it should allow for a good amount of moisture to just wick through it and escape to the atmosphere and just evaporate. So hopefully the next time we check in on these so-called African nightcrawler bins, they'll look a little bit less damp and a little less sticky and maybe fewer, you know, springtails. And I'm still curious about what those little tiny white things were. If anyone out there thinks they know what it is, then I'd love to hear your ideas on what that stuff is. So, all right, I think we're done here. I'll put everything away and get things cleaned up, but I won't take your time with that because that's boring. Let me just sign off really quickly by saying thank you. Thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to give me a thumbs up. It's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye-bye.